Hey everyone, my name is Jessica, and I need to tell you about the most satisfying moment of my entire life. It involves my father-in-law, a pink slip, and the IRS. Trust me, this story gets better with every twist, and by the end, you'll understand why patience truly is a virtue when dealing with toxic family members. Let me start from the beginning. 3 years ago, I married David, the love of my life. He's incredible, kind, intelligent, and everything I could ever want in a partner. We met in college during our senior year, both studying business, and clicked immediately over our shared dreams of building something meaningful with our lives. David had this quiet confidence about him, this genuine kindness that drew me in from our very first conversation in the university library. The only problem? His father, Robert Kingsley. This man made my life a living nightmare from day one, and I mean that quite literally. Our very first meeting was at a family barbecue where David was nervous to introduce me. I should have taken that as a warning sign, but I was young and optimistic, thinking I could win over anyone with enough effort and genuine care. Robert was one of those guys who thought money made him better than everyone else. He owned a successful construction company and never let anyone forget it. The man drove a brand new Mercedes, lived in a mansion worth over $2 million, and wore suits that probably cost more than my monthly salary. But here's the thing about Robert. He wasn't just wealthy, he was cruel about it. From the moment David introduced me, Robert made it clear I wasn't good enough for his precious son. I was working as a mid-level accountant at a regional firm, making decent money, but nothing spectacular by Robert's standards. I'd worked my way through college, graduating with honors and landing a solid position at Henderson and Associates, a respected accounting firm in the city. I was proud of my achievements, but Robert would constantly remind me of this fact during family dinners, making sure I knew where I stood in his hierarchy. The first dinner at their house was brutal. Robert spent the entire evening asking pointed questions about my career prospects, my family's financial background, and my long-term earning potential. He asked about my parents' professions with a tone that suggested he already knew the answers wouldn't impress him. When I mentioned that my father was a high school teacher and my mother was a nurse, I saw that familiar look of disdain cross his face. He'd make comments like, "When I was your age, Jessica, I was already building my empire. What exactly are you building?" Or, "David deserves someone who can provide for him properly, not someone who counts pennies for other people." The worst part was how he'd laugh after these comments, like my financial situation was some kind of joke to him. He had this particular chuckle that made my skin crawl, condescending and dismissive, as if my entire existence was beneath his notice. David would always defend me, which I appreciated, but it created tension between him and his father. I hated being the source of conflict in their relationship. Robert knew this and used it to his advantage, making his comments just subtle enough that calling him out would make me look oversensitive. Things escalated when David and I started planning our wedding. Robert offered to pay for everything, which should have been generous, right?
Wrong.
Every decision came with strings attached and lectures about how I couldn't afford to give his son the wedding he deserved. He'd wave his checkbook around like a weapon, reminding me that without his money, David would have to settle for something beneath him. I remember one particularly awful meeting at the wedding venue. David and I had fallen in love with this beautiful garden location that was elegant but reasonably priced. Robert took one look around and announced that it wasn't good enough for a Kingsley wedding. He insisted on the most expensive country club in the area, then made sure everyone knew he was paying for it. During the tasting, he would interrupt every conversation to remind the staff that he was footing the bill and that money was no object for his son's wedding, unlike what some people could afford. The guest list became another battleground. Robert wanted to invite his business associates and golf buddies, people who barely knew David and had never met me. When I suggested limiting the guest count to keep things intimate, Robert laughed and said that intimate weddings were what poor people had when they couldn't afford to celebrate properly. Every flower arrangement, every menu choice, every detail became an opportunity for him to demonstrate his financial superiority while simultaneously diminishing my worth. The worst moment came during our reception. Robert stood up to give a speech, and instead of the traditional father's blessing, he delivered what can only be described as a roast. He talked about how proud he was of David for finding someone who made him happy, then added, "Even if that someone is still figuring out how to make a real living." The entire room went silent. I'll never forget the humiliation I felt in that moment, sitting there in my wedding dress while 200 guests stared at me with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. But I loved David, and I was determined to prove Robert wrong. I worked harder than ever, taking on extra projects and studying for certifications that might lead to promotions. I was building something, just not fast enough for Robert's standards. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning in March when my boss called me into his office. The company was downsizing due to budget cuts, and my position was being eliminated. Just like that, 3 years of dedicated service ended with a handshake and a severance package. I was devastated. Not just because I lost my job, but because I knew what this meant for my relationship with Robert. I'd given him ammunition for years of future insults. David was incredible about it, assuring me that we'd figure things out together, but I dreaded telling his father. I didn't have to wait long. That evening, David called his parents to break the news. I could hear Robert's voice through the phone, and he was laughing. Actually laughing. When David handed me the phone, Robert's first words were, "Well, Jessica, I guess we know who's going to be supporting you now." He continued with his verbal assault, saying things like, "Maybe this is a sign that you should find a career more suited to your abilities, and I hope you save some money, though I doubt someone with your financial skills managed that." Each word felt like a knife twisting in my chest. The next few weeks were brutal. Every family gathering became an opportunity for Robert to make jokes about my unemployment. He'd offer to pay for things with exaggerated concern, saying, "Don't worry, Jessica, I know money's tight for you right now." Or he'd make comments about how David was probably stressed about our financial future. At David's mother's birthday dinner, Robert made a big show of picking up the check, announcing to the entire restaurant that he was covering everyone since some people at the table were going through financial difficulties. When we attended his nephew's graduation party, he introduced me to people as David's wife who was between jobs, emphasizing the word between like it was a permanent condition rather than a temporary setback. The psychological warfare was relentless. Robert would call our house during the day, knowing I'd be home job hunting, and ask if I was keeping busy or if I needed him to put in a good word somewhere. He'd suggest entry-level positions at companies where he had connections, positions that paid half of what I'd been making. When David would defend me, Robert would hold up his hands and claim he was just trying to help, making me look ungrateful for rejecting his assistance. What Robert didn't know was that losing my job turned out to be a blessing in disguise. I used my severance money and savings to start my own accounting practice. I'd always dreamed of being my own boss, and suddenly I had the time and motivation to make it happen. David supported me completely, even taking on extra hours at his engineering job to help cover our expenses. Starting a business is never easy, but I was determined to succeed. I worked 18-hour days, reaching out to potential clients, building my reputation, and slowly growing my practice. I started by offering services to small businesses that larger firms often overlooked: family restaurants, local retail shops, freelance contractors who needed someone who understood their struggles and wouldn't talk down to them. The best part? Some of my first clients were small business owners who'd heard about my situation through mutual friends and wanted to support someone who was trying to build something from scratch. Maria, who owned a small bakery, became one of my first regular clients. She told me that she respected someone who was willing to take risks and work hard rather than just coast on family money or connections. These early clients became the foundation of my practice, and their referrals started bringing in bigger accounts. I'll never forget the day I landed my first major client, a mid-sized manufacturing company that had been unhappy with their previous accounting firm. The owner, Frank, was impressed by my attention to detail and my willingness to explain complex financial situations in plain English. When he signed the contract, I realized I'd just secured more revenue than my old job provided in 6 months. Within 6 months, I was making more money than I ever had as an employee. Within a year, I was earning twice my old salary. But I kept this information to myself. I wanted Robert to keep underestimating me. David knew about our success, of course, but we agreed to keep it quiet until the right moment. Every time Robert made a comment about my financial struggles, I would just smile and nod, knowing that I was building something he could never take away from me. That moment came when Robert announced his retirement party. After 30 years of running his construction company, he was stepping down and planned to celebrate in typical Robert fashion with an elaborate party at the country club, complete with a live band and catered dinner for 200 guests. The invitation emphasized that this was a black-tie event celebrating Robert's successful career. I could already imagine him using the party as another opportunity to highlight the contrast between his success and my supposed failure. But this time, things were going to be different. About 2 weeks before the party, something interesting happened. One of my newer clients, a small restaurant owner named Maria, came to me with a problem. She'd been contacted by the IRS about some discrepancies in her tax filings from previous years. The previous accountant had made some questionable decisions, and Maria needed help navigating the situation. Maria was terrified. She'd built her restaurant from nothing, working 16-hour days for 3 years to establish a loyal customer base and turn a profit. The idea that she might face penalties or even criminal charges for something her accountant had done was keeping her awake at night. She brought me boxes of receipts, bank statements, and tax documents, her hands shaking as she explained what the IRS letter had said. As I started reviewing her files, I could see why she was worried. Her former accountant had taken some very aggressive positions on her tax returns, claiming deductions that were questionable at best and using depreciation schedules that didn't match the actual assets. The more I dug into the paperwork, the more concerned I became about the pattern of decisions this accountant had made. As I reviewed Maria's files, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The previous accountant's letterhead listed several other clients, including Kingsley Construction. Robert's company was right there in black and white. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm a professional, and I would never use confidential client information inappropriately. But Maria's situation wasn't confidential. The IRS was already involved, and Maria was asking me to help her understand what her previous accountant had done wrong. What I discovered was a pattern of aggressive tax strategies that walked a very fine line between legal and illegal. The accountant had been inflating deductions, misclassifying expenses, and using shell companies to hide income. It was the kind of creative accounting that might slip by for a few years but would eventually catch up with everyone involved. I helped Maria prepare her amended filings and documentation for the IRS. She was grateful for my honesty and thoroughness, even though it meant she owed additional taxes. As I was finishing up her case, Maria mentioned that the IRS agent handling her investigation, Agent Patricia Williams, had expressed interest in examining all of her former accountant's clients. A plan began forming in my mind. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. If Robert had been involved in tax fraud, that was a serious crime that hurt everyone who paid their taxes honestly. I had a civic duty to ensure that Agent Williams had access to all relevant information. I reached out to Agent Williams and explained that I was representing Maria in her case. I mentioned that I'd noticed patterns in her former accountant's work that might be relevant to her broader investigation. She was very interested in hearing more. During our meeting, I provided Agent Williams with copies of all the documentation I'd prepared for Maria's case, which clearly showed the questionable practices. I also mentioned that Kingsley Construction appeared to be another client of the same accountant, though I made it clear that I had no direct knowledge of their specific situation. Agent Williams thanked me for the information and said she'd be conducting a thorough investigation of all the accountant's former clients. She mentioned that if there were significant issues, she might need to interview business owners directly to understand their involvement and cooperation level. The wheels of justice move slowly, but they do move. 2 days before Robert's retirement party, I received a call from Agent Williams. She'd found significant irregularities in Kingsley Construction's tax filings going back 5 years. The pattern was clear: inflated deductions for equipment that was never purchased, phantom employees to justify payroll deductions, and income shifted to shell companies that existed only on paper. Agent Williams needed to interview Robert immediately, and she asked if I knew how to reach him. I mentioned that he was having a retirement party that Saturday and would likely be difficult to reach before then. She asked for the details, saying she might need to contact him there if necessary. Saturday evening arrived, and David and I dressed for the party. I wore my best evening gown, and David looked handsome in his tuxedo. As we drove to the country club, David noticed I seemed unusually calm for someone who typically dreaded these family events. The country club was decorated beautifully. Robert had spared no expense, with elaborate floral arrangements, crystal chandeliers, and a string quartet playing in the corner. Guests were mingling with drinks, and the atmosphere was festive. Robert was in his element, holding court near the bar and regaling anyone who'd listen with stories of his business success. I spotted Robert across the room, and sure enough, he made a beeline for us as soon as we entered. He was already slightly drunk and in full performance mode. Well, if it isn't my unemployed daughter-in-law, he announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. How's the job search going, Jessica? Still counting other people's money, or have you given up on that too? Several people turned to look at us, and I could see the familiar mixture of embarrassment and anger on David's face. But this time I just smiled. Actually, Robert, business has been great. I've been meaning to thank you for all the motivation you've given me over the years. Robert laughed, clearly thinking I was being sarcastic. Motivation? Is that what we're calling unemployment now? Well, I'm glad I could help. Before I could respond, there was a commotion near the entrance. Agent Williams had arrived, and she was scanning the room with the focused intensity of someone on official business. She wore a simple black suit and carried a leather briefcase that screamed federal agent. She approached the reception table and spoke with the hostess, who pointed in Robert's direction. Agent Williams began walking toward us with purposeful strides. Robert was still chuckling about his latest joke when Agent Williams reached our group. "Mr. Robert Kingsley?" she asked, showing her credentials. "Yes, that's me," Robert replied, his smile fading as he registered the official nature of the interaction. "I'm Agent Patricia Williams, with the Internal Revenue Service. I need to speak with you about your tax filings for Kingsley Construction. We have some questions about discrepancies we've discovered." The color drained from Robert's face. The guests around us had gone completely silent, and I could practically hear the gossip mill starting to turn. Robert looked around desperately, as if hoping this was some kind of mistake. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Robert stammered. "This is my retirement party. Surely this can wait until Monday." Agent Williams was polite but firm. "Mr. Kingsley, this is a serious federal investigation. We need to discuss your cooperation with our inquiry into potential tax fraud. You can speak with me here, or we can continue this conversation at our office." Robert's eyes darted around the room, taking in all the faces staring at him. His colleagues, friends, and family members were witnessing what was clearly the beginning of a major scandal. The man who'd spent years lording his success over everyone was being publicly questioned about tax fraud at his own retirement party. Tax fraud? Robert repeated, his voice cracking slightly. There must be some mistake. I've always been completely honest with my taxes. Agent Williams opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. Mr. Kingsley, we have evidence of significant irregularities in your filings. Inflated equipment deductions, questionable payroll expenses, and income shifting to shell companies. We need to understand your level of involvement and cooperation. I watched Robert's world crumble in real time. His face went from pale to red to gray as the implications sank in. This wasn't just embarrassment. This was potential criminal liability that could result in substantial fines and even prison time. David grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with shock. He'd had no idea about any of this, and I could see him struggling to process what was happening to his father. Agent Williams continued, we'll need to examine all of Kingsley Construction's financial records, and we'll likely need to interview you under oath. Given the scope of the potential violations, you should consider retaining legal counsel. The string quartet had stopped playing, and the entire room was focused on the drama unfolding before them. Robert's carefully orchestrated celebration had become a public humiliation more complete than anything he'd ever dished out to me. Robert looked around desperately, and his eyes landed on me. For a moment, I saw something I'd never seen before, genuine fear, and the dawning realization that his world was falling apart. Jessica, he said quietly, you're an accountant. You understand these things. This is all just a big misunderstanding, right? The irony was delicious. The man who'd spent years belittling my profession was now hoping that same profession could save him. But more than that, he was asking for help from the person he'd consistently treated as inferior. I looked at Robert for a long moment before responding. You know, Robert, you're right that I understand these things.
I understand them very well.
In fact, I've been working closely with Agent Williams on a case involving your former accountant. The patterns of fraud are quite clear and well documented. Robert's mouth fell open as he realized the implications of what I'd just said. The daughter-in-law he dismissed and humiliated had been instrumental in exposing his crimes. Agent Williams nodded at me with professional respect. Mrs. Jessica has been extremely helpful in our investigation. Her cooperation and expertise have been invaluable in understanding the scope of the fraudulent activity. The room was completely silent except for the sound of Robert's heavy breathing. His retirement party had become his worst nightmare, and the unemployed loser he'd mocked was being praised by a federal agent for bringing him down. David was staring at me with a mixture of shock and admiration. He'd known about my business success, but he hadn't known about my role in the investigation. I could see him putting the pieces together and realizing that I'd been playing a much longer game than anyone had imagined. I think we should continue this conversation somewhere more private, Agent Williams suggested, though the damage to Robert's reputation was already done. Everyone at the party now knew that the guest of honor was under federal investigation for tax fraud. As Agent Williams and Robert moved toward a private dining room, the party guests erupted in whispers. Robert's business associates were undoubtedly wondering about their own exposure, while his social circle was already distancing themselves from the scandal. I turned to David, who was still processing everything that had just happened. How long have you known? He asked quietly. About the investigation? Only a couple of weeks. But I've known your father was trouble for much longer. David nodded slowly. I'm sorry, Jessica. I'm sorry for how he's treated you all these years. I should have done more to stop it. I took his hand. You don't need to apologize for your father's choices. But I hope you understand why I had to do this. It wasn't about revenge. It was about doing what was right.
He squeezed my hand.
I know. And I'm proud of you. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within a week, news of Robert's investigation had spread throughout the business community. I watched from the sidelines as Robert's carefully constructed empire began to unravel. His business partners started distancing themselves, and clients began questioning their contracts with Kingsley Construction. The local business journal ran a front-page story about the investigation, complete with a photo of Robert from the retirement party, looking shocked and disheveled. The headline read, "Local construction magnate under federal tax investigation." David showed me the article with a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment. His father, who had always portrayed himself as a pillar of the business community, was now the subject of scandal and speculation. Kingsley Construction's reputation was destroyed, and several major contracts were canceled. The company that Robert had spent 30 years building crumbled in a matter of days. His employees, many of whom had worked for him for years, suddenly found themselves looking for new jobs as clients pulled their projects and suppliers demanded immediate payment for outstanding invoices. The IRS investigation revealed that Robert had evaded over $800,000 in taxes over 5 years. The amount was staggering, representing not just individual mistakes, but a systematic pattern of fraud that had been going on for years. He faced criminal charges for tax fraud and was looking at significant fines and potential prison time. His lawyer advised him to cooperate fully and hope for leniency, but the evidence was overwhelming. Meanwhile, my accounting practice continued to grow. Word spread about my role in exposing the fraud, and I gained a reputation for integrity and thoroughness. Ironically, several of Robert's former clients came to me for help cleaning up their own tax situations and ensuring they weren't involved in any questionable practices. The man who'd spent years telling me I'd never amount to anything was facing financial ruin while I was building the successful business he'd always claimed I was incapable of creating. 6 months after the retirement party, Robert pleaded guilty to federal tax evasion charges. He received 3 years in prison and was ordered to pay full restitution plus penalties totaling over $1.5 million. The mansion had to be sold, along with the Mercedes and most of his other assets. David and I visited him once before he began his sentence. He looked like a broken man, aged years in just a few months. For the first time since I'd known him, Robert spoke to me with something approaching respect. "I underestimated you," he admitted quietly. "I thought you were weak, but you were just patient." I didn't feel triumphant in that moment. I felt sad for David, who was losing his father to his own greed and arrogance. But I also felt vindicated. The man who'd made my life miserable for years had finally faced consequences for his actions. "I never wanted this to happen," I told him honestly. "But when I discovered what you've been doing, I couldn't ignore it. Too many honest people work hard and pay their taxes for me to stay silent about fraud." Robert nodded. "I know. I made my choices, and now I have to live with them. I just hope someday you and David can forgive me." As we left the prison that day, David and I talked about the future. We'd survived Robert's attempts to destroy our relationship, my unemployment, and the stress of starting a business. We'd come out stronger on the other side. Today, my accounting practice employs 12 people and serves over 300 clients. I've built something real and honest, something I'm proud of. We've expanded into 2 office suites, and I'm considering opening a second location across town. My team includes some of the best young accountants in the city, people who share my commitment to integrity and client service. David and I bought our first house last year. Not as grand as Robert's mansion, but it's ours, earned through hard work and integrity. It's a beautiful colonial in a quiet neighborhood, with a garden where I grow vegetables and a home office where I can work when I need quiet time to focus on complex cases. We're even talking about starting a family soon, something that feels possible now that we've built a stable foundation together. The business has grown beyond my wildest dreams. Last year, we were recognized by the State Accounting Board for our community service work, helping small business owners navigate complex tax situations. I've spoken at several conferences about ethical accounting practices, and I've been invited to serve on a committee that's developing new standards for the profession. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about what happened to Robert. The truth is, I don't. I didn't create the fraud. I just helped expose it. Robert chose to cheat the system, and he chose to treat people badly. Those choices had consequences. When I think about all the honest business owners who struggled to pay their taxes while Robert was cheating the system, I know I did the right thing. What I learned from this whole experience is that success isn't just about money or status. It's about character. Robert had wealth and power, but he used them to hurt people. When his house of cards finally fell, he had no one left to support him because he'd spent years burning bridges and making enemies. I built my success on honesty, hard work, and treating people with respect. When I needed help starting my business, friends and clients rallied around me because they knew I was trustworthy. The relationships I'd built through integrity became the foundation of my success. The last I heard, Robert was working in the prison laundry, earning 20 cents an hour. The man who'd once mocked my salary was now making less in a day than I earn in 5 minutes. I don't take pleasure in his suffering, but I can't deny there's a certain poetic justice to it. As for me, I'm exactly where I want to be. I have a successful business, a loving husband, and the satisfaction of knowing I built everything honestly. And every time someone tries to belittle or underestimate me, I remember Robert's face when Agent Williams walked into that retirement party. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Sometimes we're not planning our next move. We're planning your last one. That's my story. Thanks for listening, and remember, karma might be slow, but she always delivers. Make sure you're on the right side when she does.